having me this evening to talk about our BERDO, the Building Energy Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance, as well as the work that the City of Boston is presently engaged in around expanding and updating that ordinance. I also want to briefly introduce Asrura Pasha, who's on the call as well, who is just recently started last week as who is also working on the building emissions performance standard, as well as the building energy reporting and disclosure ordinance work.
Hi, very happy to be here. Unfortunately, my camera is being a little problematic right now, but very happy to meet all of you.
And as I dive into this, I just want to give a huge shout out to the other folks on our City Environment Department team, Allison Brizius, Catherine Eschel, and Brenda Pike, who, along with myself and Azura, have done significant amount of work over the prior couple months on this work, and we're really excited to talk to you about what it looks like. So, Heather, do you mind giving me access to share my screen real quick? It would not be a Zoom presentation if there weren't at least one technical difficulty. So it is tradition.
Now, do you have to request it? See, I'm new at having the controls here.
It might be under the participant menu.
Oh, sure. Yep. That's right. Okay.
Yeah, you want to go or you want me to go? Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, you got it now. Great.
Thanks so much. Let's just dive in.
And Ben, I was just going to ask, do you want to hold questions till the end, or how do you want to do that?
We have quite a few slides, so if folks can keep the questions to chat, I'm happy to interrupt at any point and take on any particular questions, but there'll be plenty of time for a more in-depth discussion at the end. Does that sound good for folks?
Yep, that sounds good.
Great. So once again, I'm here to talk about the emissions performance standard for large existing buildings, the City of Boston. In terms of agenda, I'm going to briefly give a kind of a policy overview of what the city is working on, an overview of the existing BERDO requirements, a brief cut at some of the decarbonization analysis that the city has been engaged in, and kind of walk through the building emissions performance targets that the city is interested in implementing. So just to dive straight into the overview. What this is about is lowering emissions and lowering emissions very quickly for Boston. Presently, the city is well on track for meeting our 2020 emissions reduction targets, but which is here represented by the red line. But we have a fair amount of work to do to get to what is our 2050 emissions reductions targets. Also, would folks please mind just muting if you can? Thank you. And this work is geared around bending this curve and getting us on track for fully going carbon neutral as a city towards 2050. The underlying impetus for this is that a huge chunk of the citywide emissions, about at least over half of citywide emissions, come from the largest buildings in Boston. So these, while about a quarter or 20% comes from more small residential, and the remainder about 20 to 30% comes from transportation. So large commercial, large residential, hospitals, universities, labs. This is the bulk of citywide greenhouse gas emissions. We know that for a carbon reduction strategies that we need to be promoting is about reducing efficiency, improving efficiency, reducing energy demand across the whole built space, electrifying basically everything, electrifying heating demand and energy consumption, and then moving that whole big pile of electricity demand towards 100% clean energy. And these are the philosophies that the city is trying to implement with this work. In terms of the building stock that we're working with in Boston, the expectations based off of current analysis is that about in 2050, about 15 or so percentage of the citywide built space will be built between now and then. It will be new construction. And obviously that's a whole big part of the conversation, is making sure that that new built space is meeting net zero targets. The real bigger problem and the bigger challenge is all the existing buildings. This graph kind of shows to you that the bulk of our citywide square footage was built before 1950. And there's a significant number of buildings, 86,000 in fact, that will eventually need to be retrofit across Boston. So that's the goal. Here's what we're working with now. The building energy reporting and disclosure ordinance, or BERDO, passed back in 2013, requires that all larger buildings in the city above about 35,000 square feet report their energy usage to the city on an annual basis. The city then makes that data publicly available. This is a lot of the work that myself and Ezra are engaged in. And on top of that is an additional requirement around making sure that those buildings covered by the ordinance are reporting the data, but they also required to do a certain amount of energy efficiency work, a certain amount of auditing every 5 years or so. And this has worked okay for the time being, but the takeaways from a lot of analysis and stakeholder engagement work has found that this is not meeting our requirements and not meeting our goals. So back in 2019, the city went through a very large stakeholder engagement process to bring in, this is back in the time where you used to be allowed to meet in person, better days. We had a process with community members, stakeholders, local organizations on how do we update our 2019 climate action plan to be in line with those previously mentioned emissions reduction targets. And one of the main strategies came from that was strategy number 5, was develop a emissions performance standard to decarbonize our largest existing buildings. The reason being that this is a direct means of touching the biggest emitters in the city, and while still providing a certain amount of ingrained flexibility for them to find ways to best decarbonize their buildings. And what this means in practice is that we have BERDO as it currently exists, and our goal is build a better BERDO. We will, in our current thinking, the annual energy reporting and disclosure piece will stay. But the second piece of having this energy action assessment requirement, which is the part of BERDO that requires a certain amount of energy reduction per every 5 years, but has these carve outs. Well, if you do an energy audit, well, you don't have to meet those reduction targets. We're going to replace that piece and put in what carbon emission and performance standards that sets very specific carbon emission targets for all the building types within the city. And the work that we've been doing basically since the actual pandemic started, ironically enough, a lot of this work began in February and March, has been a really in-depth process of analyzing the existing data, analyzing the built space, and bringing in the very large number of stakeholders that this type of really far-sighted policy could impact. So on the one side of things, and which we'll probably be talking the most about, we have the technical advisory group, which includes many folks from BSA and other organizations who are local expertise in building sciences, construction, architecture, so forth, and really diving into the existing data that we have on Boston buildings and finding and determining what are some of the pathways for these buildings to decarbonize. On the other side of things, we have a resident advisory group, which is made up of a lot of the frontline communities that are impacted by climate change, displacement, and other social equity and environmental justice issues here in Boston. And their work has been a lot about how do we craft this policy in a way where it's benefiting those most in need in the city while meeting our emissions reduction goals. On top of that, we've had dozens upon dozens of one-off meetings with individual building owners, commercial tenants, labor organizations, folks like you all here, trying to bring in every piece of expertise we can within the building sector here in Boston. And yeah, so the resident advisory group meeting has been about developing the emissions performance standard in such a way that maximizes benefits and minimizes harm for Boston's frontline populations. So in terms of the timeline, the climate action plan was released back in October. And since March, we've had multiple technical advisory group meetings, residential advisory group meetings. We're having our 6th technical advisory group meeting this coming week, with further advisory group meetings and completion of the technical analysis planned at least into next month. We have a hope, fingers crossed, that we have a final policy proposal ready to be analyzed and potentially critiqued quite a fair amount from the community by December. In terms of the analysis of the emissions reduction so far, we've been working with Synapse Energy Economics and doing these deep dives into the existing BERDO data sets of energy, electricity, natural gas, water, steam, oil, all of this data that we've been acquiring since 2014 through the BERDO program. The work that they've done is to analyze this BERDO data, develop out some net zero carbon performance policy elements, identify some of the individualized decarbonization pathways for individual buildings, coming up with specific targets for some of these building typologies, and then finally estimating the cost impact of meeting such a emissions performance standard. At a very, very high level, these are some of the high level takeaways from the data where in this graph you see the entirety of the BERDO data set for 2018, and these are large buildings above 35,000 square feet, multifamily, hospitals, the Prudential Center, Northeastern University, the whole breadth that you can imagine of large buildings in a city, broken up into the major typologies that we've identified, from universities, schools, healthcare, and more. And these are roughly where the energy demand is coming from and going for these different sectors. And when diving even deeper into what is that energy utilized for, with one of the big takeaways is that space heating is a huge part of the overall energy demand for the city, and that puts a very big emphasis on the need to be promoting energy efficiency and insulation and envelope improvements as a major and critical strategy for decarbonization. So in this graph, this is taking every BERDO building from 2018 and turning them into a tiny little rod, essentially. So those are these little vertical lines, separated out by the different typologies: office, retail, healthcare. The x-axis is square footage. So the wider the tiny little rod is, the larger square footage. The height is its emissions intensity. So how much greenhouse gas emissions per square foot does this building usually emit? And therefore the overall area of those lines represents the total emissions for a particular building. The point of this graph, and beyond being kind of pretty, is that it's meant to demonstrate that there's a clear pattern that you see across multiple sectors, where you have very high emitting, low performing buildings on the far left hand side for each for each category, with a number of buildings kind of middling in between, and a number of high performing, low greenhouse gas emitting on the far right hand side for each of these categories: office, multifamily, hospitals, and so forth. This helps inform what's going into what's the zero net carbon pathway analysis. So we're taking those buildings as is. How do we take them now in the emissions and bring them down to a net zero standard by 2050? So the work that Synapse has been engaged in has put a lot of emphasis on analyzing these individual model buildings, looking at the types of systems that they will need in order to perform deep retrofits, in order to complete electrification of the space heating systems, and then putting all that energy demand back onto on-site or off-site renewable energy. By quantifying those particular strategies, we can figure out what is the outward envelope of the technically feasible at various stages over the next 30 years, as well as what are the cost impacts of getting to that point. So all that comes down to this very, very super draft, it's a draft, analysis of what could be potential emission standards for these covered buildings. And the idea here is, we have our net neutrality by 2050 goals. We have intermediary emissions reduction goals from 2030 going all the way out. These numbers are taking our current buildings as is and finding what are the strategies and what are the targets that we think we can reasonably set for them at these different timeline intervals of 2025, 2030, 35, all the way down to, as you can see, net neutrality in 2050. And they are catered and specifically corrected for the specific subsectors that you see, where, as would be expected, multifamily housing has a low emissions target than, say, hospitals and the manufacturing sector, because the type of energy demand that those spaces need will be different. In terms of figuring the cost implications of this, we took a look at some of the main strategies on offer for buildings in this space. So here we see, the gross load of a 2018 emissions, where looking at all the different strategies towards 2050 in terms of grid improvements from the electrical grid just becoming greener. So that's to specific buildings, specific energy efficiency measures, electrification, IT equipment improvements, on-site solar, HVAC improvements, and what are the step-by-steps that you can get from this 2018 baseline of greenhouse gas emissions towards 2050. Another way of saying this is that we know that the grid is going to get cleaner, and we know that buildings can offset a fair amount of the electrical demand from purchasing renewable energy. What are the strategies that seem most likely that they could be implementing towards just cutting into those bits of emissions demand so that they're ready for full electrification and accepting of a 100% renewable energy grid? From that, the Synapse has done a lot of work on taking those specific energy efficiency measures that have been identified as what would be necessary to get our buildings to net zero, and finding out the costs for them. We relied a lot on Mass Save, Mass CEC, and other rec market data sets, as well as some case studies across North America and Northern Europe, to come up with an estimated life cycle costs through 2050 of these emissions reduction goals. And the idea here is that we're trying to figure out like what if we are pushing people in one direction towards energy efficiency, towards electrification, towards renewable energy, you know, what is the cost going to be look like, and how and what kind of resources will the city need to be able to provide, as well as sticks potentially on offer in order to get buildings onto that right track. So this again is some of those these particular strategies mapped out in terms of total avoided emissions that we estimate will be coming from the different types of lighting retrofit work, the clean power supply work, the plug load efficiency, and more to get us to our targets. And so this gets into a little bit more of the technical piece for covered buildings, but the hope here is to give you an idea on the efforts that the city is trying to take into is to make sure that these targets that we are setting for individual buildings are fair and reasonable for their use category, while still stringent enough that keeps us on track towards net neutrality. So one piece that we're incorporating is that those previously mentioned emissions target numbers are meant to represent an ideal building. But as we all know, like just an office building, just a multifamily apartment building, etc. But we know that that's kind of rare in the real world. Many multifamily buildings have restaurants, retail, a data center, even offices have, you know, office buildings have data centers, hospitals have offices, and so forth. And the hope, one factor we're going to be including is allowing for kind of a weighted average approach for setting of these emissions reduction goals. So just to walk through one example here, this is a high, you know, this is on the left-hand side is the total emissions of a sample building in 2016 through 2018. The emissions numbers fluctuate a bit, but moving forward towards 2050, that they need to be looking into strategies that help them, you know, get beneath a 2025 emissions target, 2030, and so forth. A better performing, lower emitting building has a little bit more time. That, let's say this building has done a lot of energy efficiency. Maybe this building did a lot of energy efficiency work. They went through mass save. They are on a better pathway to compliance, so they don't need to do anything for maybe the first few compliance cycles. They already fall beneath the emissions targets, but this gives them a little bit more time to be planning ahead and figuring out what kind of deep retrofit work might be needed if they're going to get towards the 2035 emissions targets, and more so towards 2050. One other approach is, what if this building is part of a larger portfolio? Say Northeastern, Boston Properties, Peabody, any number of large commercial, residential, realty groups or institutions. They might choose to combine their portfolio into a single emissions target or a single self-improvement pathway for their buildings. This is an element of flexibility that the city wants to be incorporating here. And in such a situation that, say, some of the buildings might fall below or above a specific emissions target, and so this might help them bank a little bit for the overall portfolios. You know, that they have a couple bad buildings, a couple good buildings, so they might fall underneath the 2025 blended average emissions target, but that would give them a little bit more time to plan out how they're going to lower their emissions for the worst performers. So it's a very, very, very high level, a lot of information I just kind of dumped there, but I really wanted to spend as much time as we can just to talk through people about what this analysis has kind of shown, and what are your thoughts on what this might mean for your work areas. So I want to open it up as much as I can to questions and comments from there. I see one question from Greta on what metrics are being used to evaluate emissions. is that question, in terms of the measurement, we're measuring them as kilograms of CO2 equivalent per square foot. That's the, we feel is and a good measure for being fair to different buildings of different sizes, as well as consistent with a lot of common greenhouse gas reporting and analysis. Are the proposed limits based off of emissions per EPA e-grid carbon factors? No, or not exactly. So there are two really big areas where, so the EPA has specific emissions factors for the ISO the New England electrical grid that we don't agree is accurate. And so we're going to be relying on grid emissions coefficients and factors related to what we get from the electrical grid, but corrected for through the DPU and the Department of Public Utilities and Department of Energy and Resources from the state. So that's similarly on the similarly on the front of district steam. Portfolio energy, EPA and portfolio manager have very specific grid emissions factors for units of steam energy that we don't think are accurate for our vicinity and MATEP district steam plants. So we're going to be relying on locally specific emissions factors for that. And those emissions factors went into the analysis that you just saw. And natural gas, we are currently doing some analysis on. There's some thoughts on whether or not we want to use the EPA's emissions coefficients, because, but we want to be sure that they're using a reasonable global warming potential for natural gas. Okay, I got a question on, can you elaborate on some ideas on how building owners and designers can use this data to improve buildings? Sure. So currently in the current version of BERDO, every year we disclose data. We spent a whole year collecting data, and then in October, a couple weeks ago, we released an aggregate data set, a data set showing all the buildings that reported and what their energy consumption was in the prior year. And the hope has been that buildings can use this to kind of see where they stand relative to competitors. Excuse me. Tenants might be able to more accurately choose buildings that they wish to occupy based off of the performance. The hope was to create more market transparency. The actual impact of that has been relatively minor, to be frank. And so this policy and the point of the performance standard is to set specific emissions targets for covered buildings, that using the data that we receive from them and all this analysis we've done, setting specific greenhouse gas per square foot targets for all these covered buildings that they need to meet on a escalating basis, that these targets are designed to decrease over time. So buildings cannot rest on their laurels. They have to keep moving, keep improving, keep lowering the emissions. And the idea is that if a building does not meet its target, that there may be some form of basically compliance payment or offsetting that might be necessary for them in order to meet it. So a lot of the costing analysis has gone into trying to figure out, come up with a number per ton measure for emissions that we can, use as a means to encourage buildings to more rapidly get underneath the specific targets. Got a question on, so hopefully that helps answer that question. I had a question on how are renewable energy sources factored into the analysis and what assumptions are made about the availability of offsite energy credits. So quite a fair amount of research has been gone into renewable energy sources. And so let's see if I want to check to see if I included that slide in the backup. But the there is, we do know that we do want to include renewable energy, allow for renewable energy purchasing in this work. But we also know that it's very easy. There are types of renewable energy credits that are pretty low cost and cheap at this time. And if it's possible for someone to just pay effectively dollars on the megawatt and therefore offset all the electricity, then there's not that strong of incentive for them to improve their energy efficiency. So we're looking at a somewhat tighter requirements when it comes to renewable energy purchasing. And to that end, we're thinking of this, while this is very preliminary, the thought is that the Massachusetts Class 1 requirements for renewable energy credits is likely what we'll be aligning ourselves with. So this would directly exclude things such as unbundled Texas wind farm recs, for instance. That said, we do want to have compliance pathways that might be allowing for things such as long-term power purchasing agreements outside of New England that do meet certain additionality criteria. And that's an area we're still exploring. So for instance, Boston University built a very, very big wind farm out in South Dakota, and they're very proud of that. And I think by any measure, that is an example of additionality being demonstrated from a renewable energy project. So that's something that we want to allow for, but the focus is on keeping as much of the renewable energy development local as possible.
Do you have any calculations based on how many acres of solar panels are we going to have to cut down forests? Are we going to give up agricultural land? You know, I have not seen anyone really address what the land use implications of something like the city of Boston, if everyone went for, you know, these credits instead of tightening up their envelope.
I think that's a very fair point. The two notes on that is, on one, I mean, short answer is I don't have an immediate answer for you, but that's something we can take a look into. Part of the reason why we're going with Mass Class 1 RECs is, one, frankly, the cost a bit more, and the requirements on the environmental impact are more significant than a lot of more low cost renewable energy credits that you've seen. So that, we feel, creates a strong countervailing incentive to do efficiency first. I mean, that's the idea. We want people to do efficiency first, then electrification, then renewables. That's really the sequencing of work that it makes the most sense from a financial standpoint, makes most sense from, and hopefully most sense from how we're structuring this requirement. And also with the Mass Class 1 approach, that will allow for things such as offshore wind as it becomes more available in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Maine, and elsewhere. As that begins to be fed more into the grid, that would also be something available. But that said, that's not a complete answer to your question, so it's something I will have to look more into.
I guess I just wonder, is anybody looking at it? And I think the Massachusetts Audubon Society and some groups like that are trying to address it, but so I guess the answer is not sure, maybe.
No, not sure, but it should be analyzed. And you know, this is one policy among many that the city is pursuing for carbon reduction. It's a very big policy with a lot of features, but we know this is not going to be a one shot, and this is not the silver bullet to all of our problems. So making sure that these other questions on environmental impact, as well as other questions such as embodied emissions, embodied carbon, also start to be covered by other policies and programs for the city.
Right. Thank you. Thanks very much.
I see a question about, could you elaborate on specific challenges colleges face when lowering their emissions? Do you know any specifics about Northeastern University? I'm currently a student there. Not super familiar with what Northeastern University particularly. I can say generally, campuses such as Northeastern, BU, and others face a lot of the same questions that any buildings face. It's, you know, you need to do insulation work, you need to do energy efficiency, you need to be doing lighting upgrades and on-site renewables and more. Some of the unique problems for universities tend to be around things such as district energy sources, that some universities in Boston have cogen, i.e. Combined heat and power, um, excuse me, systems that are a little bit trickier to decarbonize. They are very distinct efficiency gains you gain from those type of systems, but they still run off of natural gas for the most part, and that is a particular hurdle that will need to be faced. But they also have a certain amount of, you know, resources in terms of both space and, you know, financing, that an institution like Northeastern, they're not going anywhere, hopefully. Harvard, BU, Suffolk, Boston College, these are institutions that have been around for a very long time and likely will continue to be. So that gives them an opportunity to have a far longer planning horizons than a lot of small, you know, mid-sized commercial developers and multifamily developers. So they could be making those big long-term investments on-site efficiency work, on envelope improvements, and off-site renewable energy projects. And I think that, you know, not to pick on Northeastern or anyone else, but that should be where they're starting to put their attention towards meeting policies such as this.
Kind of a follow-up question real quick. Do you know if there are any specific challenges that private or public universities face, like if they have an easier time getting funding or like finding the actual like intellect to do that?
Yeah, I mean, that is a real question. Again, I can't speak to any individual university's financial situation, but many private universities tend to be in a better financial situation due to the existence of large financial endowments that they're able to pull from for these big capital investments. I can also, on a very weird related tangent, right now my former grad school, the New School in New York, is going through some difficult financial problems, in part because of COVID. And one of the reasons why is that the New School, this is very off topic, but they have a very more, let's say, eclectic, idiosyncratic students that come out of them. And those such people, such as, you know, bearded environmentalists working for local government, or might not have as much money to be giving to endowments as, say, Harvard, that may have more, you know, Wall Street investors that leave from there. So that is, you know, endowments and donations from alumni are a huge source of alumni for capital improvement type projects for these universities. And unique situations will vary a lot, but that has to be factored in when these institutions are thinking about this.
Great, thank you.
Of course. I have a question on a cost basis. The energy cost savings payback for window replacements are decades long. Yep. For this and other energy efficiency improvements, what are the plans for funding mechanisms for implemented proposed upgrades? And that's a very good point. And that's very much factored into the cost analysis that we're looking at, is that, you know, these are not low-hanging fruit anymore that we're going to be asking people to do. You know, if they haven't done the LED retrofits already, one, like, why haven't they? It's kind of like, it's basically free money. But two, do that now, but it's the types of efficiency improvements that are going to be asked for from things like that are far more serious and do have those long-term time horizons. But we're looking at a 30-year time horizon for this policy right now. But it's a very good point on making sure that the city itself, as well, in partnership with the utilities, Mass Save program, the Commonwealth, are working together on providing as much incentivization as we can. And this is still an area that we're exploring. It's one of the biggest follow-up questions that we're going to be focusing on. Part of this requirement and this ordinance will be that for those buildings that can't meet the particular targets, you know, they have the option of paying into alternative compliance payment, and gives them a little bit more flexibility, especially with those with particularly hard to decarbonize building energy systems. the hope, excuse me, the hope is over time that pool of money will be able to help leverage to pay for some of these big ticket, long payback period of efficiency improvement work. But I think also the point brought up is another reason why we need to be making far more stringent requirements for new construction right now. And this is a tangential but related problem that any new building over 20 to 35,000 square feet or plus built in Boston, going through the current design review process, they're going to eventually be covered by this requirement, and they're going to eventually be required to meet a net zero level of performance. And if the designers and architects and developers don't have that as part of the vision, they're setting themselves up for failure down the line, or more accurately, they're setting themselves up for really big and expensive efficiency work that they have to do. Like, not to pick on any individual buildings, but there's definitely types of buildings that have been built in the city over the last 20 years that might not be the most efficient. It might be really expensive for them to do window replacements, like a glass curtain wall building that's all triple pane, argon filled, all that great fresh from Germany. That's pricey. That's really pricey. But that might be necessary for some buildings. So they need to start factoring in these sort of cost implications now to save themselves over the next 30 years. But again, once again, it's also going to be on the city and the state to, as well as the utility finance programs, to helping buildings meet those particular needs. Question, you mentioned working on future database of emissions for type of building. Could you speak about possible timeframes for making this type of information public? Sure. So right now, just to understand your question better, all the data that this is taking from is already public. This is all data that's released annually through the BERDO program, and we have data every year going back to 2014, released publicly. And most, we just released our calendar year 2019 data set, and we've been doing most of our analysis on the 2018 data set. So, but that data exists in a very raw form. And you can play around the spreadsheets. It's a very messy data set, so it's got to do a lot of cleaning. Right now, we're finalizing the technical analysis that's going behind this policy, and that will include a public report just going into detail of everything we did, how it came up with these numbers, and what these specific emissions targets are coming from. So that is, fingers crossed, hopefully going to be finalized over the next few months, probably before the end of the year, with a preliminary draft analysis done sometime in late November, early December. And with a goal of moving towards a finalized policy sometime in December and early next year. Other questions? Thoughts? Does this sound like a terrible idea? Are we off our rocker a little bit here?
I think it's a great idea, and thanks for presenting about it, because I was very curious but didn't really know, where to start. So I'm happy that someone or some organization is taking the initiative and organizing all this data so that way we can use it. And I think that is also exciting, but also the challenge is, how do we use all this data that's not necessarily, reflective of the consumption that use, but it's the best that we have at this time. So yeah, I'm very interested to see how this information can be easily digest and accessible to the public, so that way we can do more with it, and like you said, start building better buildings today in the design phase, so that way we don't set ourselves up for failure. Personally, I work on a lot of existing buildings, also in Boston, masonry repairs and roofs and things like that. So it's difficult from, I feel like, my experience to take this information and design a building that's going to be zero energy consumption in like X amount of years from now, because I'm only working on one component, such as the roof, which we all know the critical detail is how do you tie the roof into the wall system. And you can have, you know, an R factor of 50 on your roof, but if your walls are 10, you know, it's like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
So that's kind of my problem as to where I can take this information and then apply it into my everyday projects. I don't think I'm the only one that has that problem.
And I think that's a very, very good point where a lot of the work that the city is going to be engaged in, you know, if this gets passed and if this gets implemented, is on how better means to convey what this policy means to covered buildings and those people working with them. And that would include, you know, and the hope, the goal here, and the reason why we're setting these like 2050, 2040, these long-term emissions targets is to create planning horizons, so to create long-term planning horizons for the, you know, the previous Northeastern University to the mom and pop landlord in Back Bay to everything in between, so they can see where they are relative to these standards and start to think about what are the different pathways for compliance that they can implement. We're very explicitly being technologically specific, non-specific, that's a terrible sentence, but like we're not prescribing specific technologies in this work, but we're providing a framework in by these performance metrics where whatever the market deems as the most cost-effective strategies for decarbonization for particular buildings can be pursued. It should also be noted there's legal reasons why we're going this direction. As you may know, the state determines the building code. The city does not determine the building code. We can't touch building codes. We can touch performance codes, which is why we're focusing on that. But we're very non-prescriptive in this way. And the hope is for you and your teams that, you know, eventually you're able to put this more front and center as a discussion topic between, you know, the folks working the roof, the folks working the walls, the folks working on the energy efficient, the HVAC equipment, and then obviously the building owners and the people who actually, you know, cut the checks. So I guess the question I have for you all is how can we make your lives easier in that work? What, you know, what ways in which, you know, once and if this gets passed and we're implementing it, what kind of ways can we convey this information that you find most accessible and best in getting those conversations going?
I think that those matrix that you're talking about being able to have existing data and having, you know, understanding of what benchmarks are helps us move it forward for clients. You know, going in front of clients with saying we want to be at 0 is hard. But if you can say, you know, your building type is X and, you know, this is where you fall in the spectrum of that is a lot easier, especially if you have a motivated client. They want to be on the upper end of that and they're pushing for it. I mean, we saw that with EUIs of buildings. You know, people became very fluent. You know, we get RFPs with EUIs in them now, you know, from, you know, lay people who have nothing to do with the building industry. Well, if you can do that with carbon emissions right now, that's, you know, tonnage of carbon is a hard concept for people. It doesn't make a lot of sense to them, but if you can put it in matrix, like I think it would, you know, this is really helpful for us, because when we've been doing, you know, we'll do a tally for a possible building, but we can't show what that means in comparison to buildings of its like of a similar type. So I'm very excited about what you're talking about. This is great. Thank you for that.
Thank you. And, you know, we are creating a very, very, very big forcing function, excuse me, to be frank. Like, and we know that, and it's served as desirable. But you're right that right now, if this loads, you know, we have this table, and this is to be finalized. There's probably a lot of negotiations going to go into getting these numbers exactly right, and more analysis to be done. But the point is that this sets a specific framework in which folks like you can start to do far more deeper analysis on your buildings. Obviously, we also have to get out there exactly how we're calculating GHG emissions and all that other stuff. But, you know, this is a starting point. But I think one of the areas of work that we're going to be very focused on is turning this table, which is a starting point, into something a lot more interactive and a lot more easy to engage with, that kind of drills down into individual buildings. And while, you know, I don't know if there's folks on this call specifically with any institutions or any companies who have or either own or manage buildings in Boston. Right now, we're doing a lot of one-to-one conversations with folks, with, you know, the Boston Properties, with the Fenway, with, you know, any, you know, all sorts of property owners, just taking the building, relating it to these numbers, and showing them where they stand and where does their portfolio stand to these. So if you or your clients have anything in mind, please reach out to me, and we can set up one of these one-to-ones to just start this hand-holding process that we want to be going. Obviously, this thing hasn't been passed yet, so everything's preliminary, but we want these conversations to be happening as early as possible. Other thoughts? I can also, I don't think I see. Yeah. So just in case anyone hasn't seen yet, this is my email address, benjamin.silverman@boston.gov. Reach out to me or anyone else from our team, and we're very happy to you know, do some more one-on-one conversations with you, and I'll do other presentations. This is one of many of these presentations that we're giving, trying to elicit feedback, thoughts, complaints, criticisms, and ideas of how to go about this. But it's an important moment right now for the city, for climate change action, for the built space, and I think this is a huge opportunity for us, and definitely a huge opportunity for a lot of the folks on this call to, you know, make a really big difference.
That's great. Thanks, Ben. Great presentation. I think, yeah, it's great information, and it's super important. And Boston has a super unique building, you know, building stock there. So
That we do.
yeah.
And we love every single one of them. One thing, and we're flexible. We're trying to find what makes the most sense for us. You know, these are high-level targets, but we also imagine that there'll likely be some, you know, wiggle rooms that we're going to need to provide for different types of buildings. Hospitals are a very particular tricky one. You know, especially now, we're not going to force a hospital to, God forbid, turn off an MRI machine or whatever to save electricity or anything like that. We also aren't going to force Boston's amazing historic buildings to potentially damage their facades in any way. So these are areas of flexibility that we know we're going to eventually have to build into this requirement. So, you know, having these conversations now on what are the outward, you know, how far can we push this for all these large buildings in the city is really important. So I just threw on my email onto the chat in case anyone didn't write that down.
Thank you. I think any more questions, or is that'll wrap it up tonight? Well, I appreciate everyone coming out, and I hope you all have got some good information to take back for your work.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, we'll be having a board BEC meeting, so just we'll be hanging on to this call. So if you're interested in participating in that, please stay on.
Thank you.
I have a question about the board meeting. Is it open to anyone? I'm just a student affiliate, but I'd love to watch if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. glad that you're interested.
Of course.